Two cousins vanished at a county fair in 1987. 38 years later, a dusty storage unit revealed the truth. That's how the story is told now, in headlines and whispers. But back then, on that warm July night, it didn't start as a tragedy. It started with the smells of popcorn and corn dogs in the air, the sounds of carousel music mixing with shrieks from the Tilt-a-Whirl, and the kind of laughter you only hear on summer nights when no one wants to go home. It was the Harrison County Fair, the biggest event of the year in this small Midwestern town. For weeks leading up to it, kids counted down days like Christmas. Parents planned their weekends around it. And for cousins Lisa and Marcy, both teenagers, it was more than a fair, it was freedom. Lisa was 15, the quieter of the two. She had long, dark hair she ironed straight every morning, a habit she picked up after reading in a magazine that boys like shiny hair. She wasn't boy crazy, not exactly, but she wanted to be noticed. Her room was plastered with posters of Madonna and Bon Jovi, and she carried a small spiral notebook where she wrote her dreams in tiny, looping handwriting. Marcy, 17, was the opposite. Loud, outgoing, with a messy mop of blonde curls she rarely bothered brushing. She wore ripped jeans with band patches sewn on, and she had a way of making friends with anyone, from the popular kids to the loners smoking behind the bleachers. People said Marcy had a wild streak, but those who really knew her swore she was just curious, just hungry for the world beyond their little town. That Friday night, July 3rd, 1987, the cousins convinced Lisa's mom to drop them off at the fairgrounds just after dark. The Ferris wheel was lit up in red, white, and blue for the upcoming holiday weekend. Fireworks were scheduled for the next night, and there was already a buzz in the air. Lisa's mom remembered the girls tumbling out of the car, laughing, Marcy tugging Lisa by the hand like she always did. She remembered Lisa calling back, "We'll call if we're late," the kind of promise teenagers make without thinking twice. That was the last time she saw them. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began, to the fair itself, the town that raised them, and the night everything changed. The Harrison County Fair had been running for over 70 years by then. It wasn't flashy like the state fair, but for this town, it was the social event of the summer. Families came for livestock competitions, fried food, and tractor pulls. Teenagers came for the rides, the music, and most of all, the chance to escape watchful parents and feel, for one night, like adults. The fairgrounds were spread over 20 acres on the edge of town. Picture it, the smell of hay mingling with funnel cakes, the glow of neon lights against a darkening sky, the crunch of gravel beneath sneakers. Music blaring from a local cover band near the beer tent, shouts from carnies calling, "Step right up, test your strength, win a prize." Lisa and Marcy were spotted several times that evening. At the ring toss booth, where Lisa tried 3 times to win a stuffed bear, but missed every throw. At the cotton candy stand, where Marcy bought 2, one pink, one blue, and said she'd eat both just to prove a point. At the Ferris wheel, where a friend remembered Lisa looking nervous as Marcy teased her about being scared of heights. Everything about that night seemed normal, ordinary. Until it wasn't. By 10 p.m., friends who had seen them earlier assumed they'd gone home. By 11, Lisa's mom, waiting by the phone, started pacing. By midnight, when no one had called and no headlights appeared in the driveway, she knew something was wrong. The next morning, the cousins' absence became the town's nightmare. And over the next few days, the search that followed would uncover strange sightings, whispered rumors, and a chilling possibility no one wanted to believe. But the truth, the real truth, wouldn't come for 38 years. That was the beginning. The fair, the lights, the cousins walking hand in hand into the night, and somewhere in that sea of laughter and music, they slipped out of sight. And the question that haunted Harrison County for nearly 4 decades was simple. Where did they go? The morning after the fair, July 4th, dawned hot and sticky. Fireworks posters were taped in the windows of the gas station, the kind that showed smiling families in lawn chairs. But in Lisa's house, there was no celebrating. Her mother, Judy, hadn't slept. She spent the night sitting by the phone, the kitchen light burning like a beacon. Every car that passed made her rush to the window. Every minute that ticked by was a reminder that her daughter wasn't home. By 6 a.m., Judy called Marcy's parents, her sister and brother-in-law, thinking maybe the girls had slipped in there during the night. But no, Marcy's bed was empty too. Her parents, Donna and Greg, said they hadn't heard from her since yesterday afternoon. Panic rose like a tide in Judy's chest. "We're calling the police," she told them. At 8 a.m., Officer Tom Keller, a patrolman who had been with the department less than 5 years, knocked on Judy's door. He listened carefully as she described the night before the girls dropped at the fair around 7, spotted at a few booths, never seen after. At first, Keller's tone was calm, reassuring. "It's the fair. Kids lose track of time, meet friends, maybe even decide to crash at someone's house. Happens every year." But Judy shook her head. "Not Lisa. She'd never stay out without telling me. Not both of them." Marcy's parents arrived moments later, looking rattled, Donna clutching a crumpled dish towel as if she'd grabbed it by instinct when the phone rang. Together, the families pleaded with Keller. These girls weren't runaways. Something was wrong. By noon, word spread through town like wildfire. At the diner, people whispered over pancakes. At the hardware store, a clerk turned to his coworker and said, "You hear about the Harrison girls? Gone after the fair." The sheriff's department set up a small command post at the fairgrounds, where the rides still spun, music still blared, and kids still laughed as if nothing had happened. Officers walked the gravel paths, calling out for Lisa and Marcy, checking bathrooms, peering under bleachers. They even climbed into the livestock barns, calling into the shadows, where the smell of hay was heavy and flies buzzed lazily. But there was no sign. The Ferris wheel operator remembered 2 girls who might have matched their description, but he wasn't sure. The man at the cotton candy stand said he thought he saw them around 10. The details blurred. Teenagers looked the same in the neon lights, and no one could pin down the last moment they were seen. By evening, panic had shifted into full-blown fear. Flyers were printed on the copier at the sheriff's office, black and white photos of the cousins with missing in bold letters across the top. Volunteers taped them to telephone poles, the grocery store window, the post office bulletin board. That night, fireworks boomed over Harrison County. Families spread blankets in fields and looked up at the sky. But in 2 houses, the sound was unbearable. Every crack of light reminded them that Lisa and Marcy weren't there, weren't laughing, weren't safe. Judy sat on the porch, her hands gripping the armrests so tight her knuckles whitened. Donna and Greg clutched Marcy's pillow, pressing it to their faces, as if the smell of her shampoo could bring her back. The fair went on, but for these families, time had stopped. The first search parties were formed the next morning. Neighbors, church friends, even farmers who barely knew the families showed up with flashlights and boots. They scoured fields, creek beds, and abandoned barns. Men with hunting dogs walked the wooded trails, the animals sniffing furiously. One man swore he found a scrap of fabric snagged on barbed wire, but it turned out to be nothing more than a torn rag from a feed sack. Another thought he saw footprints by the riverbank, small enough to be teenage girls, but the sheriff said they were too faint, too washed out to mean anything. For days, the town searched, and each day, hope thinned, replaced by the gnawing dread that Lisa and Marcy had been taken, swallowed by the night, never to come home. The sheriff, pressed by reporters, made a statement. "At this time, we are treating the girls' disappearance as suspicious. We have no evidence of foul play, but we are not ruling anything out." Behind closed doors, Judy and Donna didn't need official words. They already knew. Mothers know. Something terrible had happened. But the question was, what? And that summer, theories began to swirl like smoke. The disappearance of Lisa and Marcy spread through Harrison County like a lightning strike. By the end of the first week, their faces weren't just on flyers, they were on the evening news, broadcast into living rooms across the Midwest. And with that spotlight came something the families hadn't expected: rumors. At first, the whispers were quiet. Neighbors muttering on porches, co-workers talking on lunch breaks, teenagers gossiping in the hallways of the roller rink. But within days, the whispers grew louder than the truth. On Monday morning, just 3 days after the cousins vanished, a woman called the sheriff's office. She swore she had seen 2 girls matching their description walking along Route 50, heading east toward the state line. She even claimed Marcy was carrying a duffel bag. Deputies rushed out, driving the stretch of highway, scanning ditches and farm fields. Nothing. No footprints, no bag, no trace. That night, another call came in from a truck stop diner 40 miles away. A waitress said 2 teenage girls came in around midnight, ordered fries, and seemed nervous. But when she was shown the photos of Lisa and Marcy, she hesitated. Could be them. Could be someone else. The sheriff's department logged both tips, but without proof, they were just that, tips. At the grocery store, one woman told another that she heard Lisa had been secretly dating an older man, and maybe they'd run off together. At the high school, kids whispered that Marcy had talked about leaving this boring town just weeks earlier. Some swore she had friends in Chicago who could have picked her up. Others said it was darker than that. They remembered seeing unfamiliar men at the fair, carnival workers with rough hands and thick accents, drifters who appeared just for the season. One man in particular, a game booth operator, became the focus of quiet suspicion. He had been seen joking with teenage girls, handing out free stuffed animals. When police tried to interview him, he had already left town with the carnival. By the second week, the rumor mill had transformed the girls into characters in 100 different stories. To some, they were runaways, to others, victims of a predator. And to a few, the most fearful, they had been taken by something bigger than one man. This was the late 1980s, the height of the so-called satanic panic. Across the country, communities whispered about cults, secret rituals, and kidnappings. Harrison County was no different. When searchers found a circle of stones near the riverbank, probably just kids messing around, it was enough to ignite the rumor that the girls had been taken by a cult. At church, people prayed aloud against dark forces in their town. At the feed store, men muttered about strange cars seen on back roads in the weeks before the fair. One woman even claimed a psychic told her the cousins were alive, being held in a basement near running water. That vague image sent volunteers combing every creekside barn in the county, but of course, nothing turned up. The families watched helplessly as their daughters' lives were reduced to theories and campfire stories. Judy would later say, "It felt like they stopped being real people. They became rumors, and rumors don't hug you, don't leave their shoes by the back door." By mid-July, news vans rolled into town. Reporters in crisp shirts and feathered hair stood in front of the fairgrounds, telling viewers that two cousins had vanished without a trace. The camera panned across the Ferris wheel, still spinning, its cheerful music jarring against the grim tone of the broadcast. Local papers ran headlines like, "Terror at the Fair" and "Predator Among Us." Each article carried grainy photos of Lisa and Marcy, smiling in snapshots taken long before that summer night. For the families, it was surreal. They were thrust into the spotlight, giving tearful interviews, begging for the girls' safe return. Judy appeared on television, her voice trembling as she said, "Lisa, if you can hear me, if you see this, come home. We'll work it out. Just come home." The attention brought more tips, but also more cruelty. Anonymous callers left messages at the house, cruel pranks, heavy breathing, even one man who whispered, "They're never coming back." At first, the whole town united. Neighbors brought casseroles, volunteers organized search parties, churches held vigils. But as weeks dragged into months with no answers, a fracture appeared. Some whispered that maybe the families weren't telling the whole story, that maybe the girls had planned to run away, and the parents were too ashamed to admit it. Others blamed the sheriff's office, saying they hadn't taken the case seriously enough at first. And then there were those who just wanted to forget. "It's sad," they'd say, lowering their voices, "but life goes on." That divide cut deep. Judy stopped going to the grocery store after overhearing two women near the produce section say, "I heard the mother was too strict. No wonder the girl ran off." Marcy's parents, Donna and Greg, stopped attending church after a sermon hinted that the sins of the young may have brought trouble upon them. The search for truth was slowly being buried under a mountain of gossip. One of the few leads that investigators took seriously came from a farmer named Raymond Holt. He reported seeing a dark van pulled off near the county fairgrounds that night, its engine running, headlights off. He swore he saw two figures, looked like girls, near the back of the vehicle. But when deputies followed up, there was no license plate number, no further detail. Just a van, one of thousands that could have passed through Harrison County that summer. The tip was filed away. By late summer, Harrison County wasn't the same place anymore. Parents clutched their children tighter at the fair. Teenagers who once roamed free now had curfews enforced. The fair itself seemed darker, its rides creaking under neon lights, its music sounding more like a dirge than a celebration. The disappearance of Lisa and Marcy hung in the air like smoke after a fire. And though no one admitted it out loud, there was a chilling realization spreading quietly through the town. If two girls could vanish from the most crowded, well-lit place in the county, then no one was truly safe. That was the summer when Harrison County lost more than 2 cousins. It lost its innocence. But while the rumors burned hot in 1987, they eventually cooled. Search parties dwindled. Flyers faded in the Sunday. Investigators moved on to other cases. For Lisa and Marcy's families, though, the silence was unbearable. And as the years passed, what had started as whispers of sightings and theories would harden into a decades-long silence, a silence broken only 38 years later when a storage unit revealed the truth. The sheriff's department in Harrison County wasn't built for cases like this. It was a modest force, a handful of deputies, 1 dispatcher, and Sheriff Bill Yates, a man with 30 years on the job, more accustomed to cattle theft and bar fights than potential abductions. But with 2 teenage girls missing from the county's most public event, Sheriff Yates knew the spotlight was on him, and he knew he had to produce answers. The problem was, every answer led only to more questions. Almost immediately, suspicion turned toward the carnival crew that had rolled into town a week before the fair. The workers were outsiders, men with tattoos, rough clothes, and no roots in Harrison County. Parents had long warned their kids to stay clear of them. One name kept coming up: Eddie Fast Hands Carter, a 32-year-old drifter who ran the milk bottle toss booth. Several parents recalled seeing him chatting with groups of teenage girls, handing out free game tokens, and flashing a crooked grin. When deputies went looking for Eddie, they found he had already moved on with the carnival, headed to the next small-town fair in another state. An all-points bulletin went out, and weeks later, Eddie was tracked down. He agreed to be interviewed. In the interrogation room, Eddie leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He admitted he flirted with girls at the fair, but insisted it was harmless. "That's part of the act," he said. "Get 'em to play the game, spend their dimes." He swore he never saw Lisa or Marcy, never spoke to them, never lured them anywhere. He even had alibis. Several fellow workers claimed he was with them the night the girls vanished, breaking down equipment and drinking beer behind the rides. Without evidence, Eddie walked free. But in town, his name lingered like a bad taste. People muttered, "That carny knows more than he's saying." Another lead came from a farmer who remembered a shady-looking man hanging around the beer tent. The man was described as mid-40s, unshaven, wearing a dirty denim jacket. He was seen talking to several young girls, though no one remembered seeing him leave. Deputies canvassed the area, trying to track him down. They checked motels, questioned gas station attendants, even sent a sketch to surrounding counties. No one identified him. No one even knew if he gave a real name. To this day, he remains a ghost in the story, a man who appeared at the fair and vanished just as quickly. For a while, suspicion shifted closer to home. Investigators learned that Marcy had been casually dating an older boy, not much older, but enough to raise eyebrows. His name was Chris Tanner, 19 years old, a mechanic's apprentice who drove a cherry-red Camaro. Chris admitted he and Marcy had dated on and off. He said they argued a week before the fair when she accused him of flirting with another girl. But he swore he hadn't seen her that night. Police questioned him for hours. His story held. He claimed he'd spent the evening with friends drinking near the quarry. Those friends, after some nervous hesitation, confirmed his alibi. Still, rumors took root. Some whispered that Chris had lost his temper and done something terrible. Others said Marcy had been planning to run off with him. The truth? No one knew. Perhaps the most chilling lead came from multiple witnesses who mentioned a dark van lurking near the fairgrounds. A teenager recalled seeing the van parked with its engine running. A mother said she thought she saw 2 girls near the back of it. The description varied. Some said it was brown, others said blue. Some swore it had out-of-state plates, others couldn't remember. Deputies checked vehicle registrations, pulled over vans in surrounding counties, and interviewed dozens of owners. Nothing matched. The van became a phantom always there in the shadows of memory, never caught on paper. For Judy and Donna, the mothers, the thought of their daughters being forced into the back of a van was unbearable. Judy later said, "I'd wake up at night, sweating, hearing the sound of a sliding door. I couldn't shake it. That van haunted me." As weeks turned to months, desperation grew. The sheriff's office received dozens of tips, some legitimate, most useless. One man walked in off the street and claimed he knew where the girls were buried. Deputies took him seriously at first, but under questioning, it became clear he was drunk and rambling. He eventually admitted he made it up for attention. Another time, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. It was scrawled in messy handwriting, "I have the girls. Don't look for them." Investigators traced the note back to a group of teenagers who admitted it was a prank. They thought it would be funny. For the families, each false lead was a knife to the heart. Each time the phone rang, hope surged and then shattered. By August, with no suspects and growing pressure from the media, the FBI was called to assist. Agents interviewed carnival workers across multiple states, checked registries of known sex offenders, and compared the case to other disappearances in the Midwest. They found similarities: girls taken from fairs, highways, and small towns, but no solid connection. No fingerprints, no DNA, no physical evidence tied Lisa or Marcy to any suspect. One agent later said, "It was like they walked off the face of the earth. No trace, nothing left behind. Cases like that don't sit well with you. They keep you up at night." As cruel as it sounds, investigators also looked inward at the families themselves. It's standard procedure. In disappearances, loved ones are often suspects until cleared. Judy was asked where she had been the night Lisa vanished. She calmly explained she was at home, waiting by the phone. Donna and Greg were questioned about their marriage, their parenting, their daughter's friends. The implications stung. "They were treating us like suspects," Donna said later, "as if we hadn't already lost everything." No evidence ever pointed toward the families, but the damage was done. Trust between them and law enforcement fractured. By fall of 1987, the case was grinding to a halt. Leads dried up, witnesses contradicted each other, carnival workers dispersed to other states, suspects had alibis. The sheriff held one last press conference before winter. "We are continuing to investigate all leads," he said, but his voice carried the weight of exhaustion. Behind him, Judy and Donna clutched framed photos of their daughters, faces hollowed by grief. The fairgrounds stood empty now, the rides packed up, the gravel lot silent. Only the Ferris wheel remained in memory, turning slowly against a black summer sky, the last place Lisa and Marcy were ever seen. The community wanted closure. They wanted someone to blame, someone to point at and say, "There, that's who took them." But all they had were shadows. And shadows don't go to trial. The case didn't just stall, it froze. And as the years turned into decades, those suspects, those false leads, those cruel rumors would fade into the background. But for the families, the silence was worse than any false confession. Silence meant there was nothing left to chase, nothing but the memories of two cousins, frozen in time at a summer fair. And that silence would last nearly 4 decades, until the storage unit opened. The days after Lisa and Marcy vanished felt endless, but as days turned into weeks, then months, and finally years, time became something else entirely for their families. It wasn't measured in calendars or seasons anymore. It was measured in absence. For Judy, Lisa's mother, mornings were the hardest. She would walk past her daughter's room and pause at the door. At first, she tried to keep the room exactly as Lisa had left it, the Bon Jovi poster taped slightly crooked on the wall, the notebook on the nightstand, the brush with strands of dark hair tangled in its bristles. For weeks, she refused to touch anything, as if leaving it frozen in time might somehow allow Lisa to walk back in and pick up where she had left off. But weeks stretched into months, and the room shifted from shrine to wound. Every object became a reminder, a taunt. Some mornings, Judy would fling the door shut just to stop herself from staring too long. Donna and Greg, Marcy's parents, faced a different kind of grief. Marcy had always been louder, more chaotic, a storm in their house. Without her, the silence was deafening. Greg took to fixing things that didn't need fixing, rehanging shelves, patching cracks, painting the same fence over and over, as if constant work might fill the void. Donna carried Marcy's pillow with her from room to room for months. She pressed her face into it at night, long after the scent of her daughter's shampoo faded. The families clung to each other at first. They spent long evenings together, holding coffee mugs that went cold, replaying every detail of the night of the fair, as though an overlooked clue might surface. They called the sheriff's office constantly, demanding updates, begging for new searches. For a while, they believed every ring of the phone might be the one that brought the girls back. But as the years stretched, hope turned corrosive. Judy began to clash with Donna and Greg, not because they didn't love each other, but because grief makes strange enemies. Donna wanted to keep pushing the police, to keep the story in the news. Judy, exhausted by the whispers and the endless retellings, began to shut down. "Every time I open my mouth, I feel like I'm lying," she once told a reporter. "I say Lisa is missing, but what I mean is Lisa is gone, and I can't keep pretending." The marriages suffered too. Greg and Donna's once playful banter thinned into short, practical exchanges. Judy's husband, quiet by nature, grew quieter still, until silence was their only form of conversation. A wedge of guilt lay beneath it all. Each parent wondered if they could have done something differently that night. Should they have stayed at the fair, insisted the girls be home earlier, driven back to pick them up instead of trusting a phone call? The questions never ended. They looped like broken records in their heads. Birthdays became the cruelest reminders. Each year the families gathered anyway, candles burning on untouched cakes, presents wrapped but never opened. At Lisa's 16th birthday, Judy's sister brought a card and signed it from all of us. Judy stared at it for a long time before setting it on the counter. "There's no all of us anymore," she whispered. By Marcy's 18th birthday, Donna couldn't bring herself to host a gathering. Instead, she lit a candle by herself in the kitchen and cried until the wax burned out. The holidays were no kinder. Christmas stockings hung limp without their owners. Family portraits grew older, but two faces never changed. The cousins were locked in that summer forever 15 and 17, smiling on old Polaroids, while the rest of the world marched forward. The toll wasn't just within the families. Harrison County itself bore scars. The fair lost some of its magic. Parents clutched their children tighter, and teenagers rolled their eyes at curfews but obeyed them anyway. For years after, every time the fair returned, whispers followed, "This is where those two girls disappeared." The Ferris wheel lights still shone, but beneath them lay an invisible shadow. As the 90s arrived, the case grew colder. New sheriffs were elected. New deputies filled the ranks. Boxes of files were stacked in evidence rooms, gathering dust. Reporters moved on to fresher stories, and the media spotlight dimmed. For most of the town, life resumed. Children grew up, couples divorced, farms changed hands. The fair kept spinning. But for Judy and Donna, life remained stuck in 1987. They lived in the stillness of unanswered questions, in the ache of not knowing. Judy developed rituals to cope. Every year on the anniversary, she drove out to the empty fairgrounds, parked her car, and sat in silence. Sometimes she prayed, sometimes she shouted. Other times she simply sat, staring at the gravel lot where she last saw her daughter. Donna, in contrast, couldn't bear to return. She avoided the fairgrounds entirely, taking back roads just to keep from glimpsing the Ferris wheel rising above the trees. Friends tried to comfort them. Some said, "You have to let go." Others offered the cruel cliché, "Maybe it's better you don't know." But the families never stopped needing answers. They lived with the weight of two chairs always empty at the table, two bedrooms frozen in time, two futures erased. As the years rolled on, the families changed too. Wrinkles deepened, hair grayed, hands trembled with age. But one thing remained the same: the photos. On mantels, on nightstands, on refrigerators, Lisa and Marcy's faces stayed 15 and 17. Time moved forward for everyone else, but not for them. And perhaps that was the hardest toll of all, to keep aging while the people you love remain forever young in your memory. By the time the two families passed the 20-year mark, many in town assumed the girls were dead. The searches had long stopped. The vigils grew smaller each year. Newer generations barely remembered the case at all. But Judy and Donna never gave up, even when their hope shifted from finding the girls alive to simply knowing what had happened. "It's the not knowing that kills you," Judy once said. "If I knew she was gone, I could grieve. But when you don't know, you grieve every day, over and over again." For nearly 4 decades, they carried that weight. And then, when most had stopped looking, when the case was little more than a footnote in dusty records, a storage unit door rolled open. And everything that had been buried in silence came rushing back to the surface. By the early 90s, Lisa and Marcy's disappearance had become less an active case and more a shadow that lingered over Harrison County. The initial storm of attention had passed. News vans no longer parked outside the sheriff's office, and the headlines that once screamed about missing cousins had been replaced by new tragedies, new scandals, new stories. For the families, the silence was unbearable. For the town, it was easier to let the silence settle. Inside the sheriff's department, the case files were boxed and stacked on a steel shelf. The cardboard softened with time, edges fraying as the weight of years pressed down. Deputies who had once combed the fairgrounds now worked different jobs. Some retired, some moved away. Sheriff Yates, gray-haired and heavy with guilt, admitted in private that it was the one case that would haunt him until his last breath. But in official reports, the case was simply labeled unsolved. Life marched forward. New businesses opened on Main Street, teenagers graduated, and the fair returned every summer with the same neon lights and music. The Ferris wheel still spun, but beneath its cheerful glow lay a ghost story no one could erase. Parents told their children not to stay out late, not to talk to strangers, and never, ever to wander off at the fair. But over time, those warnings became habit rather than memory, and younger generations barely knew the names Lisa and Marcy at all. For Judy, the cold years were a prison. She went through the motions of life work, chores, conversations with neighbors, but inside she was stuck in 1987. Every knock at the door, every unknown phone call, every news story about a body found somewhere in the state tore open the wound again. She clipped newspaper articles, stored them in binders, and called sheriff's offices in other counties whenever an unidentified girl was discovered. Most times, the answer was the same. It wasn't Lisa. Still, she kept looking, because to stop would mean admitting her daughter was gone forever. Donna and Greg lived their grief differently. They tried to keep Marcy's memory alive with small traditions, a birthday cake every year, a candle on Christmas Eve, a donation in her name to the local animal shelter because Marcy had loved dogs. But even those rituals began to feel hollow as the years wore on. The cake grew smaller, the candle burned quicker, the donations became checks mailed without ceremony. Their energy drained away, replaced by the weary knowledge that no matter what they did, Marcy wasn't coming home. The marriages bore scars. Judy's husband withdrew deeper into silence, burying himself in work, as if routine could shield him from grief. They coexisted like two strangers sharing a house. Donna and Greg's once vibrant bond thinned into a quiet companionship, loyal but heavy with unspoken pain. Friends tried to help, but grief is a lonely burden. Eventually, even close friends stopped bringing up Lisa and Marcy, afraid of reopening wounds, and that silence, too, became its own cruelty. In the wider world, the late 80s bled into the 90s, then the 2000s. Technology advanced, but the case stayed trapped in its original form: grainy photos, handwritten statements, missing posters that had long since yellowed with age. Now and then, a new detective would take a fresh look at the files. They would trace the same leads, interview the same witnesses, and reach the same dead ends. Each time, hope flickered briefly, only to be extinguished again. There were moments when the past clawed its way back into the present. A set of human remains discovered in another county would make the news, and phones would ring late into the night as relatives braced for answers. Each time, the DNA or dental records proved it wasn't them. Each time, the families had to bury their grief all over again. The cold years weren't just about the absence of answers. They were about the slow erosion of hope. In the beginning, Judy and Donna imagined their daughters returning, perhaps older, perhaps scarred, but alive. By the second decade, those fantasies faded. They no longer prayed for a homecoming. They prayed simply for the truth. Even if it was dark, even if it hurt, they wanted to know. The community changed too. Harrison County grew quieter, more insular. Some of the older residents still remembered the night of the fair, still whispered about the van, the carnival workers, the strange man by the beer tent. But younger people heard only fragments, passed down like folklore. To them, Lisa and Marcy were less real girls and more ghost stories told around campfires, the cousins who disappeared and were never found. The fair itself became an uneasy reminder. The rides still lit up, the games still called out, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy still filled the summer air. But for those who remembered, every spin of the Ferris wheel was a reminder of two girls who had stepped into the night and never returned. Some families stopped attending altogether, unable to bear the weight of memory. Others went anyway, determined not to let tragedy take away their tradition, but the joy was never quite the same. As the years dragged on, even the law began to lose its urgency. New crimes took priority, cold case files stacked higher, resources dwindled. The Cousins case was revisited only when anniversaries rolled around or when an eager young reporter dug it up for a feature story. But each article said the same thing: no new leads, no new evidence, no closure. By the 30-year mark, Judy and Donna were older women. Wrinkles etched their faces, hands trembled, hair turned silver. Time had marked them deeply. Yet the photos of Lisa and Marcy remained unchanged, two bright, smiling girls frozen in the summer of 1987. That, perhaps, was the cruelest wound of all. To grow old while the people you loved remained forever young in your memory. The world around them had moved forward. Harrison County built new schools, new roads, new businesses. The fair expanded with more rides, more lights. But for the families, every step forward felt like betrayal. They still set places at the table. They still talked to their daughters at night, as if speaking into the void might somehow carry across time. And then, just when the case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever, something shifted. It happened quietly, almost by accident, not in a police station or a courtroom, but in a dusty storage facility off the highway. A man failed to pay his rental fees. The unit was auctioned off, and when the door rolled open, the stale air inside carried more than dust. It carried secrets that had been buried for nearly 4 decades. Inside that unit, the silence of the cold years began to crack. It didn't start with a police investigation. It didn't come from a tip line or some detective dusting off an old file. It began with something far more ordinary, a storage unit auction. The year was 2025, 38 years after Lisa and Marcy vanished. In a small industrial strip just outside of Harrison County, there sat a row of steel doors, each leading to a rented space full of forgotten things. People stored furniture there, boxes of holiday decorations, old tools they didn't want to part with. Units rarely drew attention, except when someone stopped paying the bill. When that happened, the law was simple. The contents were auctioned off to the highest bidder. That's exactly what happened in May of that year. A man in his late 50s had fallen behind on payments. The facility sent notices, made phone calls, but no one ever responded. After the required waiting period, the unit was listed for auction. On a humid Saturday morning, a small crowd gathered. Storage auctions had become a kind of pastime, with bargain hunters hoping to strike gold in forgotten trunks or antique furniture. When the manager rolled up the metal door, a gust of stale, dusty air escaped. Inside, the light fell across mismatched furniture, boxes stacked high, and a heavy trunk shoved into the corner. From the outside, it looked ordinary enough, but there was something about the trunk that caught the eye of the winning bidder. Old, dented, with a rusted padlock. It had the weight of secrets. The buyer, a local man who made side money reselling finds, pried it open later that day in his garage. What he found inside would stop him cold. Neatly folded on top were items of clothing. Outdated, faded with time, but distinctly teenage. In style, a denim jacket with pins still attached, a t-shirt featuring Bon Jovi, a pair of jeans with the knees worn white. Beneath the clothes were personal items, a small spiral notebook, pages filled with looping teenage handwriting, a school photo tucked into the pages, a silver necklace tangled in the fabric. The man didn't recognize the names at first, scribbled inside the notebook, Lisa, Marcy. But his wife did. She grew pale as she whispered, "Those are the girls, the ones from the fair." Within hours, the sheriff's department was called, and just like that, a case long buried in silence roared back to life. Deputies arrived at the house, carefully bagging each item as evidence. They laid them out on a table, the clothes, the notebook, the necklace. The spiral's cover was bent, but inside, Lisa's handwriting was still crisp, still alive on the page. The words weren't confessions, weren't secrets. They were the dreams of a teenage girl. Notes about favorite songs, about movies she wanted to see, about how nervous she felt riding the Ferris wheel. Ordinary things, frozen in time. But the fact that those items had been locked away for nearly 4 decades was anything but ordinary. Someone had kept them, someone had hidden them. The sheriff at the time, a woman named Carla Ruiz, stood over the evidence with a mix of awe and dread. She had been a child when Lisa and Marcy disappeared, barely old enough to remember the fair that year. Now, as sheriff, she felt the weight of history pressing down. This, she told her team, is the first real break in 38 years. The discovery of the storage unit sent shockwaves through the town. For older residents, the names Lisa and Marcy came rushing back like ghosts. People who hadn't spoken of them in decades found themselves reliving the summer of 1987. For the families, it was like being pulled into a storm they thought had long since passed. Judy's hands trembled as she was shown the necklace. Donna collapsed into tears when she recognized the denim jacket Marcy had begged for that spring. Reporters descended almost immediately. "Storage unit could solve decades-old mystery," one headline read. Cameras rolled as investigators carried boxes of evidence into the sheriff's office. Interviews replayed the same question: who had rented the unit, and why were the girls' belongings inside? The name on the rental agreement was not familiar to most in town. The man had moved through Harrison County quietly, with few connections. His past was a patchwork of odd jobs and short stays, never long enough to make a mark. But the unit had been in his name for over 30 years. He'd paid the rent faithfully until just a few months before, when payments suddenly stopped. That detail chilled investigators. Whoever had hidden those belongings had done so deliberately, protecting them year after year, ensuring they stayed sealed away. But when the payments stopped, the secret slipped out. The lock was broken, the door lifted, and the past spilled back into the present. Inside the sheriff's department, the evidence was cataloged and analyzed. DNA tests were ordered on the clothing. Forensic specialists examined the notebook, the jewelry, the boxes. But even before the science came back, the emotional weight was undeniable. These were Lisa and Marcy's things. These were pieces of their lives, preserved and hidden. The families were thrust back into a nightmare they thought had gone cold. Judy couldn't bring herself to touch the items. "It's like she's still out there," she whispered. "Like she left them for me." Donna, meanwhile, stared at Marcy's jacket for hours, running her fingers over the faded denim, whispering her daughter's name. The town buzzed with speculation. Some insisted the carnival workers had been right all along, that one of them had taken the girls and kept their belongings as trophies. Others whispered about a local man, someone who had lived quietly among them, hiding a monstrous secret. Still others clung to darker theories that the storage unit was only a piece of something larger, a shadowy network, a hidden truth more sinister than one man. What was clear, though, was that the cold years were over. Harrison County was no longer frozen in silence. The case that had haunted the town for decades was open again, and for the first time, there was a trail to follow. And it all began with a rusted trunk in a forgotten storage unit, a place where secrets had slept for 38 years. What no one knew then was that the contents of that trunk were only the beginning. The truth was far darker and far closer than anyone had dared imagine. The storage unit smelled of dust and neglect. When investigators first stepped inside, their flashlights cut through the stale air, illuminating the clutter that had been packed away for decades. Old furniture leaned against the walls, a wooden dresser with one drawer missing, a cracked mirror, boxes collapsing under their own weight. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the trunk. It sat in the far corner, heavy, dented, its metal edges rusting. The padlock had already been pried off by the man who won the auction. He hadn't known what he was opening when he slid the lid back. Now, as deputies gathered around it, gloves on and evidence bags ready, the trunk was the only thing anyone looked at. Inside, it wasn't chaos. It was organized. That was the first unsettling thing. Clothes were folded neatly, stacked in layers. Each item felt deliberate, as if someone had cared enough to preserve them, but not enough to give them back. On top lay a faded denim jacket, the fabric worn soft from use. Investigators photographed it from every angle before lifting it carefully. Inside the pocket, they found a folded slip of paper, a movie ticket stub dated June 1987, just a month before the cousins disappeared. Beneath the jacket was a pile of shirts, one featuring Bon Jovi, another with the fair's own logo from the year of their disappearance. The shirts still carried faint stains, faded over time but visible under the harsh light. Each one was bagged and labeled. Then came the personal items, a spiral notebook, its blue cover bent and fraying at the edges. The first page bore Lisa's handwriting in looping script, property of Lisa H. The pages were filled with fragments of a teenage life, doodles of hearts, lyrics to songs, notes about school, scribbled thoughts about the fair. The last entry was dated the morning of July 3, 1987. It read simply, "Going to the fair with Marcy tonight. I can't wait." The pen trailed off at the end, as if she had been interrupted. There was jewelry, too. A silver necklace with a small heart charm, a pair of hoop earrings still tangled in their backing card, a plastic hair comb with 2 teeth missing. To anyone else, they might have looked like junk, but to the families, they were sacred. Judy, when shown the necklace later, broke down. "She wore that every day," she whispered. The deeper investigators went, the stranger it became. Beneath the clothes and jewelry was a collection of photographs, dozens of them, tucked into envelopes and loose in the bottom of the trunk. They weren't family pictures. They weren't snapshots from school or parties. These were candid, almost voyeuristic. Lisa and Marcy at the fair, blurred slightly as if taken from a distance, Marcy laughing with cotton candy in her hand. Lisa walking near the Ferris wheel, head turned as though she'd heard her name. None of the families had ever seen these photos before. None of them should have existed. And it wasn't just the cousins. Mixed among the stack were other faces, young girls from town, photographed at parks, at the pool, outside the grocery store. Some of those girls had grown up, married, moved away. But at the time, they had been just teenagers, unaware they were being watched. The photographs were chilling, not because of what they showed, but because of what they implied. Someone had followed the girls. Someone had studied them, documented them, kept records like trophies. And then, when Lisa and Marcy disappeared, someone locked those trophies away. At the very bottom of the trunk was the final, most disturbing find. A notebook, different from Lisa's, this one, in blocky handwriting, belonging to someone else. Its pages contained lists, names, dates, descriptions. Lisa's name appeared more than once, Marcy's too. Next to each was a date, the last one matching the night of the fair. There were notes scrawled in the margins, cryptic phrases like, "last seen near Ferris wheel" and "too close to home." The trunk was sealed, cataloged, and moved to the sheriff's office under guard. Forensic teams worked around the clock. They tested the fabrics, lifted fingerprints, scanned the photographs for hidden marks. DNA swabs were taken from every item, compared against samples from the families. When results began to trickle back, they confirmed what everyone already knew. These belonged to Lisa and Marcy. The discovery spread quickly through Harrison County. For those who remembered the summer of 1987, it was like reopening an old wound. People who hadn't spoken of the cousins in decades now found themselves haunted by the images on the evening news. The denim jacket, the notebook, the photographs laid out on evidence tables. For the families, the pain was unbearable. Donna said seeing Marcy's jacket was like being thrown back in time. I could hear her voice. I could smell her shampoo. For a moment, it felt like she was alive again. And then it hit me that she wasn't, and I lost her all over again. Judy couldn't bring herself to look at the photographs. "Those aren't memories," she said. "Those are violations. Someone was watching my daughter when she didn't even know." The sheriff, Carla Ruiz, faced a storm of questions. Who had rented the storage unit? Why had they kept the items hidden for so long? Was this the work of a predator, a collector of trophies, or something more complex? The name on the lease led to a man whose history would soon unravel into something far darker than anyone imagined. But even before investigators pieced together his past, the storage unit itself told a story. It revealed a careful, deliberate act of concealment. These items hadn't been discarded. They hadn't been abandoned. They had been preserved as if the person who kept them wasn't ready to let go, or worse, wanted to keep reliving that night. And within the folds of those clothes, the scribbles of those notebooks, the flash of those photographs, lay the first real answers Harrison County had ever had. For the first time in 38 years, the shadows around Lisa and Marcy began to take shape, and what emerged was darker than the families had ever feared. The name on the rental agreement was ordinary enough. It didn't jump out from the page like a villain's signature, and didn't carry with it any local notoriety. To most people in Harrison County, it meant nothing at all, but to investigators, it was the first solid lead in decades. The man who had rented the unit was named Richard Calloway. Born in 1957, he had grown up in the next county over, the son of a factory worker and a homemaker. His childhood, at least on paper, was unremarkable. He had attended local schools, played Little League baseball, dropped out before finishing high school, and drifted into odd jobs. To neighbors, he was quiet. To co-workers, forgettable. He didn't marry, didn't have children, didn't leave much of a trace. But as investigators dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. Richard had been a wanderer. He picked up jobs with traveling crews, carnival outfits, construction teams that moved from town to town. His name appeared in payroll records scattered across the Midwest, sometimes for only a few weeks at a time. He rarely stayed anywhere long enough to form relationships. Yet, in 1987, records showed him working with a subcontractor hired to help set up the rides at the Harrison County Fair. That detail froze investigators. The fair, the very place where Lisa and Marcy had vanished, had been one of his stops. And not just any stop. It was the summer of their disappearance. The more they looked, the more unsettling it became. Richard had rented the storage unit in 1989, just 2 years after the cousins went missing. He kept it for 36 years, paying the monthly fee religiously. No late notices, no gaps, always on time. It was only in 2025, when he fell ill and stopped paying, that the secret slipped out. Deputies tracked down what remained of Richard's life. They found him not in hiding, but in a hospice facility 2 counties over. He was 70 years old, frail, his body eaten by disease. He died only weeks before the auction, taking his secrets with him, or so he thought. With his death, investigators had to turn to paper trails, old records, and people who had crossed paths with him decades earlier. They interviewed former carnival workers, men now in their 60s and 70s, who struggled to remember faces from long ago. Some swore they remembered Richard, a quiet man who kept to himself. Others drew blanks. But the payroll records were clear he had been there. He had been in Harrison County the summer Lisa and Marcy disappeared. The photographs from the storage trunk became critical. Forensic specialists analyzed them, searching for watermarks, paper types, chemical traces. Most were printed in the late 80s, consistent with film used during that time. Some showed Lisa and Marcy at the fair, but others, chillingly, were taken in daylight in places like parks and sidewalks. Whoever held the camera had followed them for weeks, maybe months, watching, waiting. Neighbors from Richard's past were re-interviewed. One woman remembered him sitting on his porch with a camera, snapping pictures of kids playing across the street. At the time, she thought he was practicing photography. Looking back, she realized the truth was much darker. Another neighbor said Richard always seemed to know where the town's events were: school games, fairs, parades. He drifted in and out, but he watched, he observed, he collected. The notebook found in the trunk offered more. Scrawled inside were names not just Lisa and Marcy, but other girls. Some had been reported missing in different states. Others had lived long, ordinary lives, never knowing their names had been written down by a man they barely noticed. Next to Lisa's name was the note, Ferris wheel, the 3rd of July. Next to Marcy's, cotton candy, after 10. It was methodical, clinical, like notes taken by a hunter tracking prey. DNA results came back slowly. They confirmed that the clothing belonged to Lisa and Marcy. Fibers matched to their families. But more chilling was the discovery of a partial fingerprint on one of the photographs, a fingerprint that matched Richard Calloway. It was the first tangible link, tying him directly to the girls. As investigators pieced the past together, a picture formed of a man who had lived in plain sight, drifting from town to town, leaving almost no trace, but carrying with him the artifacts of his crimes. He hadn't been caught because he hadn't drawn attention. He was careful, patient, meticulous. And while most predators discarded their trophies or flaunted them, Richard had hidden his away, locked in a trunk, like secrets he could visit when the silence of his life grew too heavy. The discovery left Harrison County shaken. People who remembered the fair of 1987 asked themselves if they had seen him, a man, blending into the crowd unnoticed. Some swore they remembered a quiet worker tightening bolts on rides, moving equipment, hauling cables. Others weren't sure. After nearly 4 decades, memory blurred. But the evidence was clear. He had been there. The families, when told, were left with a mix of rage and sorrow. Judy said, "I must have walked right past him. I must have looked him in the face. And all that time, he knew where she was." Donna wept as she held Marcy's photo, whispering, "She trusted the world too much. She trusted everyone." Investigators pressed further, retracing Richard's movements across the Midwest. In at least 2 other counties, old missing persons cases bore eerie similarities, young girls vanishing near fairs or festivals. Nothing had ever tied them together before, but now, with Richard's name, detectives began to wonder if Lisa and Marcy weren't his only victims. But in Harrison County, the focus remained. After 38 years, the pieces of the puzzle were aligning. The man who had stalked, watched, and taken 2 cousins from a summer fair had been hiding in plain sight all along. And though he had died before he could be confronted, his secrets had finally spilled into the light. What investigators still didn't know, however, was the darkest part. The trunk had revealed belongings, photos, notebooks. But it hadn't revealed the answer to the question that haunted the families most of all. What had happened to Lisa and Marcy after that night? The next chapter of the investigation would uncover that truth, and when it did, the horror of those missing hours would finally come into focus. For 38 years, Harrison County had lived with a question that never found an answer. What happened to Lisa and Marcy after the fair? The storage unit had pulled the curtain back, exposing Richard Calloway as the shadow that had loomed over them all along. But it was only the beginning. Investigators still needed to piece together the final hours of July 3, 1987. The photographs told part of the story. One image showed Lisa and Marcy standing near the Ferris wheel, Lisa glancing off to the side, her mouth half open, as if she were responding to someone. The next photo, taken just minutes later, showed them walking past the cotton candy stand. Marcy was laughing, but Lisa looked tense. The angle of the pictures suggested they weren't posing. They were being watched. Witness interviews from that night, long buried in case files, began to take on new meaning. A teenager recalled seeing a man in a work shirt standing near the midway, not playing games, not on a ride, just watching. A food vendor remembered two girls matching Lisa and Marcy's description, talking briefly to a man near the service area behind the rides. At the time, none of it seemed important. Now, every small detail fit like pieces of a puzzle. Investigators reconstructed Richard's movements. As part of the carnival's setup crew, he would have had access to areas off-limits to the public service alleys, storage sheds, the fenced perimeters where equipment was stored. He knew the layout of the fairgrounds. He knew where shadows fell and where the crowds thinned as the night wore on. What investigators believe happened next was a slow, calculated approach. Richard likely singled the cousins out weeks before, following them, photographing them, writing their names in his notebook. At the fair, he may have struck up a casual conversation offering free rides, showing them a shortcut, something harmless enough to lower their guard. Marcy, ever outgoing, might have laughed it off. Lisa, quieter, might have hesitated, but together, the girls walked with him. The path Richard led them down was not the midway, not toward the parking lot where families came and went, but toward the darker edge of the fairgrounds, near the livestock barns and equipment sheds. There, noise from the rides faded, the neon lights grew faint, the smell of hay mixed with the faint oil of machinery. Few people lingered there late at night. The dark van that several witnesses recalled became the final piece. Investigators now believe Richard parked it behind a service gate, engine idling, waiting. The girls may have thought they were heading toward another ride or a shortcut to the exit. Instead, they were led straight into the trap. There were no cameras in 1987, no surveillance to confirm it. But the photographs, the notebook, and the evidence from the storage trunk made one thing clear. Richard had stalked them, lured them, and taken them from the fairgrounds without anyone realizing until it was far too late. The question of what happened afterward is harder to bear. Forensic teams searched the storage unit for traces of blood, hair, or biological evidence that could indicate the girls' fate. Some partial strands were recovered from the clothing, degraded by time but still testable. DNA confirmed they belonged to Lisa and Marcy. But there were no remains in the trunk, no bones, no direct evidence of where their bodies had gone. That silence left investigators with only theories and the chilling possibility that Richard had disposed of their bodies in a way that would never be found. Land records showed he had access to remote farmland during that time, working jobs that placed him near wooded areas, quarries, and rivers. Each one could have swallowed evidence forever. Still, the trunk itself spoke volumes. The careful preservation of their belongings suggested Richard hadn't taken them by accident or in a moment of rage. This was deliberate, planned. He wanted to remember them, to keep pieces of their lives close, long after their lives had ended. He had turned their possessions into trophies, hidden away not for anyone else to see, but for himself. For the families, this was the hardest truth to face, Judy said quietly. I always thought she'd come back. Even after all these years, some part of me thought maybe she was still out there. But this tells me she never had a chance. Donna wept as she listened, clutching Marcy's photograph. I want to hate him, she said. But more than that, I just want to know why. Why them? Why them? It was the question investigators couldn't answer. Richard had left behind no confession, no explanation, no reason written in his notebooks. He hadn't spoken to anyone about the girls. To the outside world, he was invisible. His trophies were the only voice he left behind, and they spoke only of obsession, not motive. The town, too, reeled. Harrison County had carried its ghost story for decades, never knowing who to blame, never knowing how close the danger had been. Now they knew. The man responsible had stood among them at the fair, tightening bolts on rides, blending into the crowd. He had lived nearby, quietly, while everyone else searched for answers. And while the families grew old waiting, he had paid his storage bill each month, protecting the very evidence that would eventually reveal his crime. It was not justice in the way anyone had hoped. Richard was dead, beyond the reach of courts or prisons. But the truth had finally surfaced, dragged out of the shadows by a rusted lock and a forgotten debt. The dark truth of that summer night was that Lisa and Marcy never left the fair on their own. They were taken. Stolen by a man who had been watching them, who had written their names down like entries in a ledger, who had waited for the moment when laughter turned to silence. For 38 years, their families had lived in the absence of answers. Now, at last, the picture had come into focus. It wasn't closure, not really. Closure implies peace, and peace is impossible when the ones you love are stolen. But it was truth. And for the first time in decades, Harrison County finally knew the truth. When the sheriff's office held the press conference, the room was packed. Reporters squeezed shoulder to shoulder, cameras lined the back wall, and the air was thick with anticipation. It had been nearly 4 decades since Lisa and Marcy vanished, and now, for the first time, officials were ready to stand before the public and say the words everyone had been waiting to hear. Sheriff Carla Ruiz stepped up to the microphone, her face grave, her notes trembling slightly in her hands. She laid out the findings carefully, speaking with a voice that was steady but heavy. She explained how the storage unit had been discovered, how the items inside tied directly to the missing cousins, and how the man who rented the unit, Richard Calloway, had been identified as the likely perpetrator. She described his history with the carnival, his movements across the Midwest, the photographs, the notebook, the trophies he'd hidden away. And then she said the words that silenced the room. Based on the evidence collected, we believe Richard Calloway was responsible for the abduction and deaths of Lisa Harrison and Marcy Whitfield on July 3, 1987. It wasn't justice, not in the way people wanted. The man was already dead, beyond punishment, beyond trial, but it was truth, and truth, after so many years, was its own kind of justice. For Judy, hearing it spoken aloud was both relief and devastation. She had waited 38 years for an answer, and now she had it. But it was an answer that hurt more than the questions ever had. "I can't stop thinking," she told a local reporter later, "about that night, about her walking away with him, about how scared she must have been. I finally know, but knowing doesn't feel better. It feels worse." Donna's reaction was quieter, but no less raw. She sat with Marcy's photograph in her lap, tracing her daughter's smile with her finger. "It's like I lost her all over again," she said. "But at least now I can stop wondering every time the phone rings. At least now I know where to place my grief." The families gathered privately that week, holding a service not of mourning, but of remembrance. They placed the girls' photographs side by side on the altar of the small church, where both cousins had once attended Sunday school. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers filled the pews. Some people hadn't seen the families in years, but they came anyway, drawn by the need to acknowledge the weight of the truth. The pastor spoke softly, saying, "We may never understand why, but we will remember who. We will remember Lisa and Marcy, not for how they were taken, but for how they lived." The town itself responded in waves. Some people expressed relief that the case was finally solved, that the whispers and speculation could finally end. Others felt unsettled, even betrayed, realizing the man who had haunted the story all along had been among them, unnoticed. Parents who had once brought their children to the fair now questioned how safe it had ever been. Old-timers shook their heads, muttering, "We always knew it was one of those carny workers." Younger residents, who had grown up only hearing fragments of the story, suddenly felt its weight in full. The fairgrounds, when the news broke, became something different. For decades, it had been a place of uneasy joy, its rides and music always shadowed by the memory of the cousins. Now it was almost sacred ground, the place where the truth had begun, and the place where their lives had ended. Some suggested building a memorial there, a plaque to honor the girls so they would never be forgotten again. Others argued the memory was too painful, that no one wanted to be reminded of tragedy when they brought their children to the fair. The debate lingered, unresolved. Investigators, too, carried their own burdens. For Sheriff Ruiz, the case was both her proudest and heaviest moment. She had delivered answers, but she couldn't deliver justice. She couldn't put Calloway in handcuffs, couldn't make him face trial, couldn't give the families the satisfaction of seeing him held accountable. Closure is a word we use too lightly, she admitted. This isn't closure, it's just an ending. The ripple effects reached beyond Harrison County. Other jurisdictions across the Midwest reopened old cold cases, searching their files for connections to Richard Calloway. Some families who had lost daughters years earlier called the sheriff's office, wondering if he might have been responsible for their pain too. The FBI began cross-referencing cases of girls who had vanished from fairs, festivals, and small towns during the years Richard had traveled with carnival crews. For some, the answers would never come. For others, faint new leads emerged, sparking hope that long-forgotten cases might finally see light. But in Harrison County, the focus remained on Lisa and Marcy. Their faces returned to the news, their names spoken in living rooms once more. Candlelight vigils were held in their honor. School yearbooks from 1987 were dusted off, classmates now gray-haired gathering to remember the girls they once knew. One former friend of Lisa's told a reporter, "She was shy, but she had this laugh that made you laugh too. I can still hear it." Another remembered Marcy sneaking cigarettes behind the bleachers, saying, "She always wanted to see the world. She should have had the chance." For the families, the aftermath was not neat. At Never Island, Judy struggled with anger. She felt robbed not only of her daughter, but of decades she could never reclaim. "Every Christmas, every birthday, every graduation," she said, "I was cheated of all of it." And he just kept living his life, paying his storage bill, keeping his secret. Donna carried a quieter grief. She found herself imagining what Marcy would have looked like at 30, at 40, if she had children of her own, if she had lived a full life. "I see women her age at the store," she said. "And I wonder if Marcy would have had that same hairstyle, if she would have smiled the same way." That wondering never goes away. The tragedy also forced the families to reckon with their own fractured relationships. Years of strain, of blame and silence, couldn't simply vanish with the truth. But in the wake of the revelation, there was a fragile kind of reconciliation. Judy and Donna found themselves talking more, sharing memories of the girls, even laughing at times about the mischief they once got into. For the first time in years, their grief wasn't isolating. It was shared. The town of Harrison County learned something too. For so long, the disappearance of the cousins had been a whisper, a story that lived in shadows, in rumors, in silence. Now it had a face, a name, and a truth. And though the truth was painful, it was better than silence. Closure is a word people used often in those weeks. Reporters asked about it, neighbors mentioned it, even officials leaned on it. But the families knew better. There is no closure when someone you love is stolen. There is only survival. There is learning to live with the truth, no matter how jagged it feels. For Harrison County, survival meant carrying Lisa and Marcy's memory forward, no longer as a mystery but as a warning, a story etched into the bones of the town. For the families, survival meant waking up each morning, looking at photographs of two smiling girls, frozen in 1987, and whispering their names into the quiet. The man responsible was gone. The truth was finally known. But the echoes of that summer night would never fully fade.